On the morning of October 14, 2003, Father Dominic Reyes administered last rites to a man named Calvin Hooper inside the Crestwood State Penitentiary death chamber. And when the DNA results came back 14 months later, the man strapped to that gurney had never been Calvin Hooper at all. By the time the full scope of what happened inside Crestwood was uncovered, investigators would find that this wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't even the first time. And the person responsible had been walking those fluorescent corridors, eating in that cafeteria, sleeping in one of those cells, for nearly a decade before anyone thought to look. Crestwood State Penitentiary sits in a hollow between two low Pennsylvania hills that seem to lean toward each other, like they're whispering. If you've ever driven Route 9 in early November, you know the kind of light that falls out there, gray and thin, the color of old dishwater, pressing down on the fields. The prison itself is a squat, brutalist structure built in 1961, all poured concrete and narrow windows, the kind of building that was designed to make you feel smaller just by looking at it. When the wind comes off the hills, it pushes against the outer walls and makes a sound that former guards have described as breathing. Low, slow, patient. Father Dominic Reyes had been the prison chaplain at Crestwood for 11 years by the time October 2003 arrived. He was 61 years old. A small man with deep-set eyes and the particular kind of stillness you sometimes find in people who have spent too long sitting with the dying. He wore bifocals that left small red indentations on the bridge of his nose, and he carried a worn leather Bible that smelled of lanolin and cigarette smoke. Not his own, but absorbed over years from the hands of the men who had held it in those final minutes, fingers trembling, knuckles white. He knew every crack in every corridor between his small office near the chapel and the execution suite at the far end of D-Wing. He knew the way the lights buzzed differently in the last stretch of hallway. Slightly lower in frequency, slightly warmer in color, as if even the electricity knew where it was going. He had walked that hallway 9 times before October 14th. He was not a man who frightened easily, but there was something about that morning he would later struggle to articulate. Not wrong exactly, something underneath wrong. Something that registered not in the mind but in the chest, like a change in pressure before a storm. Calvin Jerome Hooper had been on death row since 1996, convicted of the murder of 2 women in Allegheny County. He was 44 years old, heavy-set, with a shaved head and a tattoo of a cross on the inside of his left wrist. According to the visitation logs, his sister Margaret had come to see him 3 times in his final month. According to those same logs, she had signed in, sat across from him through the scratched plexiglass partition, and signed out. She had hugged him, the record said. She had looked him in the eye. On the morning of the execution, Father Reyes entered the holding cell at 5:47 a.m. to offer final prayer. The man sitting on the edge of the cot looked up at him. He had the right tattoo. He had the right approximate build. He had answered when the guard called the name to Calvin Hooper. He said nothing unusual. He asked Father Reyes to read from Psalms 23, which was, according to the file, Calvin Hooper's requested scripture. And here is the thing that Father Reyes told the investigators 14 months later, when they sat across from him with their yellow notepads and their careful, measured faces. He said, "The man on that cot smelled wrong. He couldn't say how. He couldn't say of what. Just wrong. Like soil after rain, dark and turned over. The smell of something that had been buried and then wasn't." He had told himself it was nerves. His own nerves. He had told himself that 11 years of death row work was catching up with him. He picked up his Bible and he began to read. And the man on the cot closed his eyes and smiled. Just slightly, just at the corner of his mouth. In a way that Calvin Hooper's sister Margaret would later swear, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and tears running silently down her face, that her brother had never once smiled in his life. The execution proceeded at 6:04 a.m. Warden Gerald Mace signed the documentation at 6:31. The body was transported to the county medical examiner's office before 8 o'clock. Standard procedure, nothing flagged. Father Reyes drove home along Route 9 with the gray November light pressing down on the windshield. And he stopped once, at a gas station outside Kellerton, and sat in the parking lot for 22 minutes without going inside. He couldn't explain why afterward. He just couldn't make himself move. He sat there with his hands in his lap and the engine running and the smell of turned earth still somewhere in the back of his sinuses. and he watched a plastic bag drift across the empty lot in slow, looping circles, and he felt the particular silence of a man who doesn't yet know what question to ask. Margaret Hooper called the prison at 9:15 that same morning. Not to confirm the execution. She already knew about that. She called because Calvin had called her the night before, from the Rose communal telephone, to say goodbye, and she was worried about him. Specifically, she was worried because something in his voice had been different. Lighter, she said, like a man who had just put down something very heavy. Like relief. And that wasn't Calvin. Calvin had been fighting his conviction since day one, filing motions, writing letters, sending her handwritten pages dense with legal arguments she barely understood. Calvin had been furious for 7 years. Calvin did not do relief. The guard who took her call logged it and passed it to the duty sergeant, and the duty sergeant noted it and filed it, and it sat in a manila folder in a cabinet in the administrative wing for 14 months, while Calvin Hooper's actual body, and it was his body, his living body, his breathing, walking, eating body, remained inside Crestwood State Penitentiary in a cell on D Wing, 400 feet from the room where someone else had been executed in his name. Let that sit with you for a moment. The real Calvin Hooper ate breakfast the morning of his own execution. Scrambled eggs, according to the kitchen log. He showered. He watched television in the common area. He was alive and present and accounted for while a man with his tattoo and his build and his requested scripture died on a gurney with a priest reading over him, and not a single person in that building noticed, because the man who had arranged it had been patient enough and careful enough, and had understood something fundamental about institutions that most people never think to examine. Which is this: when a system is confident, it stops looking. Paperwork flows in one direction. Checkboxes get ticked. Names get called and bodies answer to them, and the machinery moves forward because the machinery was designed to move forward, and the one thing it was never designed to do was stop and ask whether the body answering the name was the right one. The investigators who finally pulled on this thread, a pair of attorneys working Calvin Hooper's posthumous appeal, a woman named Sandra Chu and a man named Robert Fells, both young, both working on roughly no sleep and coffee from a machine in a hallway in Philadelphia, did not find it through brilliance. They found it because of a date discrepancy in a medical record. Calvin Hooper's prison physician had logged a routine blood pressure check on the morning of October 14th. Not the 13th. Not the 12th. The 14th. At 7:22 a.m. 78 minutes after the execution. Sandra Chu stared at that timestamp for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. The DNA confirmation came back 6 weeks later. And when it did, it didn't just confirm that the man executed on October 14th was not Calvin Hooper. Confirmed something else. Something the investigators had not been looking for. Something that turned Sandra Chu's face the color of old paper when she read it in the fluorescent quiet of her office at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. The man on that gurney had no identity on file. No match in any federal database. No fingerprint record. No dental record. No name. He was, as far as every system in the country was concerned, no one. A man executed under a borrowed name with a borrowed tattoo, and the investigators would later confirm the tattoo had been applied recently, the ink still slightly raised at the edges, still tender. Dying in place of a man who was still alive 400 feet away, and leaving behind nothing that could tell them who he actually was. But here is where it stops being a bureaucratic horror story and becomes something else entirely. Because when Sandra Chu and Robert Fells drove out to Crestwood, on a Tuesday in January, the fields along Route 9 iron-gray and frozen, the hills leaning in the way Father Reyes had always found unsettling, and when they sat down with the warden and laid out what the DNA had confirmed, and when they asked to speak with Calvin Hooper to begin